The mother of the twins, a woman worn with the weight of time and the sorrow of watching her children take such different paths, visited her son in prison one rainy afternoon. The cold metal bars and the dim light in the prison cell felt like a reflection of her own heart as she sat across from him. Her eldest son, once full of promise, now sat slumped, his face hardened by years of anger and regret. She looked into his eyes, searching for the boy she once knew, and softly asked, "How did you end up like this?" He looked at her with a sharp, bitter glare, anger rising like a tide. "My father was an alcoholic. What choice did I have?" he snapped, his voice laced with resentment. "I watched him drink, destroy everything around him. What was I supposed to do? He was my role model." His words hit her like a blow, and she sat in silence for a moment, her heart heavy with sorrow. The weight of generations seemed to bear down on her. She left without saying much more, her mind already turning to her other son. Later that day, she visited her younger twin, a man whose life had turned out so differently. The sun was setting as she arrived at his home, where laughter and warmth greeted her. His wife was preparing dinner while their two children played in the yard. The house was filled with love and joy, a stark contrast to the cold cell she had just left behind. As they sat down on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she asked him the same question that had haunted her all day. "How did you end up like this?" Her son looked at her with calm eyes, a soft smile on his face. "My father was an angry alcoholic. What choice did I have?" he said, his tone steady and thoughtful. She was taken aback by his words. "But," she began. "I watched him destroy himself and everyone around him," he continued, his voice quiet but firm. "I remember thinking as a child, that will never be me. I didn't want that life. No matter how hard it was, no matter the challenges I faced, I chose to build something different for myself and my family. I wanted peace, love, and happiness. I wanted my children to grow up in a home filled with laughter, not anger." The mother looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. Both her sons had grown up in the same house, under the same father, yet they had chosen such vastly different paths. One had allowed his past to define and trap him, while the other had used it as fuel to build a better future. As she left her younger son's home and walked into the fading light, she realized that, in the end, it wasn't their father who had shaped their lives. It was the choices they made in response to their circumstances. One had chosen to be consumed by the darkness of his upbringing, while the other had chosen to fight against it, creating a life full of light and love. The mother walked on, a bittersweet peace settling in her heart. She knew that while she couldn't change the past, both of her sons had made their own choices, and their lives were the reflections of those choices. As the mother walked along the quiet road, the wind rustling through the trees, her mind kept drifting back to the years when the twins were still boys. She remembered the small, fragile moments, the laughter, the arguments, the nights when their father would come home drunk, yelling and breaking things. How different they were even as children, one always angry, quick to mimic their father's rage, while the other would retreat into silence, seeking solace in books or his mother's arms. She had done her best to shield them from the worst of it. She had whispered comforting words in the dead of night, holding them close when their father's temper flared. She often wondered if it had been enough. As she walked further from her younger son's home, her heart both heavy and light, she realized that her role had limits. She could love them, guide them, even try to protect them, but ultimately, their paths were their own. Suddenly, a familiar voice echoed in her mind, her late husband's. It was a memory she had long tried to bury. He had been a broken man, weighed down by his own father's cruelty and his addiction. She had once believed she could fix him, that her love could cure his demons, but slowly she learned that some battles are fought alone. His drinking had stolen more than just his health, it had stolen years from their lives, from their children's childhood. And yet, as her younger son had so powerfully reminded her today, the past doesn't dictate the future. She remembered the conversation from earlier, her younger son's words still echoing. No matter how hard it was, I wanted something different for my kids. He had chosen to rise above the cycle, to forge his own way. But her other son, her firstborn, had succumbed to the same darkness that consumed his father. She wondered if it was too late for him. Could he, too, find his own way out of the prison he had built around himself, not just the physical one but the prison of bitterness and blame? That night, the mother lay awake, her mind turning. She had spent years quietly grieving, watching her husband self-destruct, and now one of her sons was on a similar path. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. The next day, she made a decision. Returning to the prison, she found her son sitting in the same gloomy cell, his face hardened with anger. But this time, she didn't ask him any questions. Instead, she told him about his brother, not to compare, but to show him that change was possible. She spoke softly, her voice filled with both love and the strength of a mother who refuses to give up. You may think that your life is set in stone because of your father, but you still have a choice. It's not too late for you to decide differently, even now. Your brother grew up under the same roof, saw the same things, felt the same pain. But he chose a different path, and so can you. Her son scoffed at first, shaking his head, unwilling to hear it. But she kept talking, her words persistent yet gentle. She told him about how his brother, despite all the anger he had witnessed, had decided not to follow the same path. You blame your father for everything, she said quietly, but the truth is, you are keeping yourself in this prison. You have the power to walk a different road even now. I believe in you. And I always will. For the first time, her son's hardened expression cracked. His eyes flickered with something other than anger, a glimmer of doubt, perhaps even a hint of hope. He didn't say much, but the silence between them felt different. It was no longer heavy with blame, but filled with the possibility of change. The mother left the prison that day with no promises or grand resolutions. She knew that her son's journey would be long and difficult, but she had planted a seed. Whether it grew or withered was up to him. As she walked home, the sky clear and bright above her, she felt lighter than she had in years. She had always believed in the power of choice, in the strength of the human heart to change, and now she had reminded her son of that truth. Time would tell whether he would take the first step, but one thing was certain, she would never stop believing in the possibility of redemption, for both her son and the family that had been through so much.